He didn't expect the smell of antiseptic and wilted lilies to feel like a memory. The halls were quiet, yet his heartbeat filled the space as if accusing him of every year he stayed away. His mother's name on the door looked unfamiliar, printed on a label too neat, too new. Inside, she sat by the window, staring at a sky that didn't remember her either. He froze, searching for traces of the woman who used to hum while folding laundry, who used to call him by a name only she ever used. Now she looked small, folded into herself. When her eyes met his, there was no recognition, only polite confusion. His voice caught in his throat, and then, softly, she whispered that old nickname, the one that had once made him feel invincible. In that single breath, time collapsed. How many miles does regret travel before it finds home? He sat beside her in silence, the hum of a distant television mixing with the rhythmic hiss of an oxygen vent. She didn't know who he was, not yet, but something in her eyes searched for familiarity. He wanted to tell her everything. The years he wasted, the apologies rehearsed but never spoken. Instead, he just held her hand, pretending this small contact could bridge decades. The nurse spoke softly from the doorway, explaining memory loss in gentle words, but he hardly listened. He wondered if the past could still hear him, if love could still find its way through broken memories. He noticed the small things, the chipped porcelain mug she once loved, the radio that no longer worked, a stack of untouched crossword puzzles. Every detail was a remnant of a woman she used to be. He wanted to ask if she remembered the creak behind their old house, the smell of rain after he fell from his bike, her laughter echoing through summer evenings. But the words stayed inside. Instead, he whispered hello again, as if repetition could bring her back to him. Later, outside by the parking lot, he sat in his car with the engine off. Rain dotted the windshield, blurring his reflection. He thought about the last time he saw her, his words sharp, her face stunned, the door closing between them. Now that memory hurt more than he could bear. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, wondering what forgiveness sounds like after years of silence. Somewhere inside, a child's voice still waited for her to call him home. That night he couldn't sleep. The sound of her whisper, that single word, that nickname, replayed endlessly in his head. It wasn't just recognition. It was forgiveness, quiet and absolute. He realized she had already forgiven him long before he ever asked. Maybe she had never stopped waiting. He closed his eyes and saw her face, not as she was now, but as she once was, bright, alive, unstoppable. Tomorrow, he decided, he would go back. He wouldn't run anymore. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds, indifferent and soft. Ethan returned to the nursing home early, his mind heavy with fragments of dreams, his mother's voice calling him from another time. When he entered her room, she smiled faintly, not knowing who he was, but sensing he belonged. The nurse greeted him quietly, explaining that Margaret had been calmer lately. He nodded, unsure how to respond. As he sat beside her again, the silence between them felt less cruel, almost familiar, like an old song played from another room. He remembered the day he left home. Rain hammered the tin roof while words flew like knives. He was 20, angry, convinced she didn't understand him. She stood in the doorway holding his jacket, saying he'd regret it one day. He laughed bitterly, slammed the door, and never looked back. Now, sitting across from her, he could still hear that echo. The sound of her voice, breaking as his footsteps faded down the road. The years hadn't dulled it. They'd only made it sharper. Back in the present, Ethan watched her eat slowly, each spoonful trembling in her thin hand. The nurse chatted softly about the weather, But Margaret's gaze was far away. He realized memory was no longer a straight line for her. It was a circle repeating, collapsing. Still, when she looked at him, he swore there was a flicker, something deep buried but real. He wanted to reach it, but the years had made him clumsy with affection. That night, Ethan found himself standing outside his childhood home. The windows were dark. Another family lived there now. He could almost hear her voice calling him in for dinner, smell the soup that used to simmer for hours. He walked along the cracked path to the old oak tree, where his father once hung a tire swing. Everything looked smaller. The air felt heavy, like time itself was watching. He whispered, a sorry meant for no one but the wind. The next morning, Margaret didn't remember him again. Her eyes met his with polite confusion, as if meeting a stranger. But when he laughed softly, she laughed too. A small, beautiful sound that didn't need recognition to feel true. Maybe love didn't require memory. Maybe it just lived in the body, waiting to surface when the heart allowed. He squeezed her hand, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. Days began to blend into each other, slow, tender repetitions of touch and silence. Ethan visited daily now, no longer keeping track of time. He helped with small things, folding blankets, pouring tea, brushing her hair. The nurse smiled quietly, recognizing what words could not. Sometimes, Margaret would hum an old tune without knowing why, and Ethan would listen like it was the first song he had ever heard. The air between them was different now, less haunted, more alive. It was as if the act of being present could heal the years absence had carved. He started bringing small things from home. Her old record player, a faded photo album, the quilt she used to wrap him in after storms. Each object breathed memory back into the room. One afternoon, as the record crackled to life, Margaret's lips moved with the lyrics, her voice fragile but true. Ethan didn't sing. He just watched, overwhelmed by the sight of her remembering through melody. For a moment she was herself again, the mother who used to dance barefoot in the kitchen, laughing at his clumsy steps. In the quiet moments when she slept, Ethan would talk, not to her, but to the space between them. He told her about the years he spent running, the jobs he hated, the nights he thought of calling but couldn't. He spoke softly, not expecting answers. It felt strange, freeing. Sometimes her breathing shifted as if she heard him, as if her body remembered what her mind had lost. He realized forgiveness might not come in words, but in the stillness of finally staying. One afternoon, Leela handed Ethan a small wooden box sheet found in a drawer. Inside were handwritten receipts, pressed flowers, and an old photo of a boy missing his front teeth. Him, maybe 6 or 7. His throat tight. Margaret stared, glancing at the photo and smiling. Though she didn't know why. For Ethan, it was proof that pieces of love had survived somewhere, hidden beneath time's decay. He promised silently that he wouldn't let them fade again. As evening fell, Ethan walked her to the window, the one she always sat beside. The world outside glowed faintly, trees swaying, birds returning to their nests. Margaret's hand rested in his, fragile but warm. For the first time, she turned toward him and smiled as if she knew. No words, no memories, just recognition, in the simplest form, touch. He felt the ache in his chest ease slightly, like a wound beginning to close. Some part of him understood he had been forgiven long before he ever asked. Ethan arrived early that morning to find Lila sorting through a drawer of old belongings. She used to keep everything, she said softly, handing him a small box tied with faded ribbon. Inside were postcards, letters, and tiny trinkets, fragments of a life carefully kept. The handwriting on the envelopes made his hands tremble. They were addressed to him, unsent, never mailed. His name written over and over in ink that had bled from tears or time. He felt the air shift around him. Every unopened letter was a confession he'd never heard. He opened the first letter slowly, afraid it might break apart. Tucked. Her words were gentle, full of small details, how she planted the roses he loved, how she hoped he'd eaten well, how she forgave him without him asking. She had written as though he might read them someday, though she knew he never would. Ethan's throat tightened as he traced the loops of her handwriting, realizing she'd been speaking to him all along, in silence. Regret flooded him, but it carried warmth this time, not punishment, like sunlight through rain. Later that afternoon, Lila helped him gather the rest of the keepsakes. There were photos, his first day at school, the backyard birthday parties, the camping trips with his father before he passed. Every image held her smile somewhere in the background, always watching, always near. Ethan realized how much of her life had revolved around him, even when had disappeared. The guilt was heavy, but beneath it, something new stirred. Gratitude, raw and unfamiliar. For the first time, he saw her not just as his mother, but as a whole person who had loved completely. When evening came, Ethan found an old journal tucked beneath the box. It wasn't just about him. It was her story, her dreams, her loneliness, her strength after his father's death. She had written about learning to forgive herself, to keep going, to wait without resentment. He read until his eyes burned, realizing she had been human all along, fragile and brave in equal measure. The discovery didn't just bring him closer to her. It made him feel known, as if she had already written his return into her pages long ago. That night, before leaving, he kissed her forehead, something he hadn't done since he was a child. She didn't stir, but her lips curved slightly, like a reflex of love buried deep in her body's memory. Ethan whispered, "I found them, Mom," his voice breaking on the last word. As he turned to go, he noticed the window slightly open, the curtains breathing in the night air. For the first time, the room didn't feel like a place of endings, but of returns. Love, it seemed, never left. It only waited to be seen again. The morning began like all the others. The same corridor hum, the same slow shuffle of nurses changing shifts. Yet something felt different. When Ethan entered the room, Margaret was awake, her eyes alert in a way he hadn't seen for months. She smiled faintly, as if she had been waiting. He froze at the door, afraid to break whatever fragile thread connected them. She said nothing, only looked at him, her gaze steady and soft. For the first time, he saw not the illness, but her, the woman who had raised him, loved him, and waited through all his silence. He approached slowly, afraid the moment would dissolve if he moved too fast. "Hi, Mom," he whispered, almost a question. She smiled again, faint but certain. Her hand lifted, trembling, reaching for his face. He felt his throat tighten as her fingers brushed his cheek. The same touch that once wiped away scraped knees and childish tears. "You came back," she said, her voice fragile yet bright. He nodded, unable to speak. It wasn't just recognition. It was forgiveness wrapped in a single breath. They spent the day together, talking softly. The words often failed. Ethan read from her old journal, his voice trembling over her handwriting. Margaret listened to it, sometimes smiling, sometimes gazing out the window, as if remembering. For a few precious hours, she was lucid, sharp, herself again. They laughed about small things. Burnt dinners, garden mishaps, old family jokes. It felt like time had folded in on itself, giving them one borrowed afternoon to rewrite everything silence had taken. By evening, her strength began to fade. She leaned back against the pillow, her eyes fluttering, her breath slow but peaceful. Ethan held her hand, tracing the lines of her palm like he was memorizing a map back to her. Then quietly, she said his childhood nickname again. The one that had shattered him days ago. But this time she said it with intention, her eyes clear, her voice steady. He laughed through tears, nodding, whispering, "Yeah, Mom, it's me." The world outside grew dim, But inside that room, everything glowed. That night he stayed by her side long after the nurses dimmed the lights. The room was quiet except for the rhythm of her breathing. He thought of all the versions of her he had known. The strong, the stern, the laughing, the fading. Now, holding her hand, he realized they were all the same woman. Memory might slip away, but love stayed. When her eyes finally closed, he whispered her name, not to wake her, but to thank her. Somewhere inside, he felt her smile. The next morning, the air in the room felt different, softer, slower, almost suspended. Margaret slept deeply, her breath uneven but calm. Ethan sat beside her, tracing the rhythm of her pulse through her wrist. Every rise and fall felt borrowed. He wanted to tell her everything before time ran out. The years, the anger, the guilt, all of it. But where do you begin when you've already said goodbye once? He closed his eyes, whispering her name like a prayer, hoping she could still hear him in the spaces between silence. He started talking. Not like before, but fully, finally. Words spilled out in fragments, how he blamed her for things that weren't her fault. How he left and never called. How he thought forgiveness would make him weak. His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. It wasn't a confession seeking absolution. It was a release, a way to hand her the truth before it was too late. The air grew heavy with honesty. Margaret stirred, eyes fluttering, as if her heart recognized the sound of her son's breaking. He told her about the loneliness, the years of pretending he didn't care. He told her he missed her voice, her stubbornness, even their arguments. He thought I was strong, he whispered, but I was just scared. Tears rolled down his cheeks unchecked. Her eyes opened slowly. Weak, unfocused, but searching. She reached out, finding his hand. Her grip was faint but certain. You came back, she murmured again. The same words as before, but softer now, a benediction, not a question. Hours passed like minutes. Ethan's voice grew tired, but he kept talking. Stories of his life, small victories, mistakes, the things he wished she'd seen. Margaret listened, eyes closed, but smiling faintly. At moments only she understood. Outside, the sky dimmed to violet, and the sounds of the nursing home quieted to whispers. He leaned close, pressing his forehead to her hand. "I'm sorry," he said at last, the words trembling free. "For everything." A single tear fell onto her skin and disappeared like it had always belonged there. Night came quietly. Margaret's breathing slowed, each breath lighter than the last. Ethan sat unmoving, hand still in hers. He didn't feel fear, only stillness, the kind that comes after truth has been spoken. He whispered again, "You were right, Mom. Regret doesn't disappear. It just waits until you're brave enough to face it." He looked at her one last time, every detail etched into memory. Her lips parted, and though no sound came, her face said everything. Forgiveness had already arrived. The morning after, the room felt impossibly still. Margaret was gone. The bed neatly made, the window open, the air carrying faint traces of lavender and sunlight. Ethan stood by the door, not crying, not yet. There was something sacred in the quiet, a peace that didn't ask for understanding. "Nurse Lila," said she, went gently, smiling in her sleep. Ethan nodded, his throat tight, his heart strangely calm. Death, he realized, wasn't an absence, it was a returning to every place she had ever loved him from. Later, Ethan helped it pack away her things. Every object told a story, a comb, a teacup, a faded cardigan. Lila handed him a small envelope marked with his name. Inside was a photo of him as a child, tucked beside a single line in her handwriting. "You were always enough." He sat down, unable to move, the words sinking into him like warmth after cold. All the years of running, All the walls he built seemed to crumble in a single heartbeat. She had known his heart all along, even when he didn't. He drove home in silence. The road blurred, trees passing like ghosts of time. When he reached the old house, he sat outside for a long while before going in. The scent of dust and pine greeted him, familiar and strange. He wandered through each room slowly, touching the walls, the old piano, the kitchen counter, where she once stood humming. Every corner whispered her presence. Grief didn't crush him, it held him gentle and steady, like her hands once did. In the kitchen, he found her teapot. The same one that used to whistle every morning before school. He boiled water, poured himself a cup, and sat at the table she once filled with laughter and stories. The house groaned softly, like it remembered. He closed his eyes and imagined her sitting across from him, sunlight on her face, saying his nickname one more time. For the first time in years he smiled. It didn't hurt anymore. It just felt full, as if she had never truly left. Before leaving, he walked to the backyard, where the old oak tree still stood. The swing his father built hung motionless, its rope frayed but strong. He sat beneath it, looking up through branches that had outlived his childhood. Wind moved softly through the leaves, a sound like breathing, like whispering. "I'm home, Mom," he said quietly. The sunlight broke through, warm and forgiving, touching his face as though answering. He smiled through tears. Love, he realized, doesn't end. It changes form, but it always finds its way back.